The second anniversary of a dead man's death is a special kind of hell. It lacks the raw, communal shock of the first, leaving you with a stale, private misery that clings to the furniture. Tonight, that misery smelled like sandalwood and whiskey. The sandalwood was for him. The whiskey was for me. Clara had finally cried herself to sleep on the sofa, her face puffy and pale in the dim light of the city glowing through our window. Our apartment. I had to keep reminding myself of that. It felt more like his. His ghost paid no rent, yet he was the primary resident. I was just the guy who paid the bills and failed to be him. The last thing she'd said, a muffled whisper into a cushion that was probably also once his, was the killer. Julian would have known what to do. He always knew. It wasn't a dagger to the heart. You get used to daggers. After 2 years of dating the woman he was supposed to marry, my heart was less a vital organ and more a well-worn dartboard. No, this was different. It was the quiet finality of it. The 1000th paper cut that makes you finally bleed out. Julian, the sainted architect, the martyred hero, the ghost with the perfect hair and a deep understanding of female grief. Julian would have known, but Julian was busy being dead. I was here, very much alive, and very much useless. I watched her for a moment, the gentle rise and fall of her chest. I loved her. God, that was the sick joke of it all. I loved her enough to live in her mausoleum, to sleep in a bed that probably still held the indentation of his perfect, heroic body. And my love had a dark, ugly twin, resentment. Tonight they were holding hands and doing shots in my skull. The whiskey bottle was half empty. My resolve was half full. It was the perfect, terrible ratio for a bad decision. My feet carried me, with the practiced stealth of a man who knows which floorboards betray him, to the bedroom closet. It was a walk-in, bigger than the first apartment I ever rented, and in the back, behind my rack of band t-shirts and worn jeans, sat the sarcophagus. A large, aromatic cedar chest, the Holy of Holies, Julian's Ark of the Covenant. Clara kept his most sacred relics in there. I wasn't allowed to touch it, look at it, or even acknowledge its existence with anything other than reverent silence. It was the one rule, the only rule. Tonight, rules felt like suggestions for other people. The lid was heavy. It lifted with a soft whoosh of trapped air, releasing a concentrated cloud of sandalwood, Old Spice, and vague perfection. It smelled like a god I wanted to punch. My eyes, adjusting to the gloom, scanned the contents. A worn leather jacket folded with military precision. A stack of vinyl records, all classical, of course. Photos. So many photos. Julian laughing on a sailboat. Julian looking pensive and brilliant over architectural blueprints. Julian and Clara, their faces pressed together, radiating a kind of incandescent joy that made my stomach clench. I was a grave robber, a ghoul sifting through the remnants of a better man. The thought should have shamed me, but the whiskey had burned my shame circuits to a crisp. I dug deeper, my fingers brushing against a hard-edged box. Underneath it, the cedar bottom felt wrong. I pressed down. A section of the wood gave way with a faint click. A false bottom. You have got to be kidding me. St. Julian had a secret compartment. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, messy rhythm that was purely mine. No ghost had a claim on this feeling. My finger slipped inside and pulled out a small, black moleskin journal. It was smooth, unassuming. I almost didn't open it. Almost. I flipped to a random page, somewhere in the middle. The handwriting was sharp, precise. The handwriting of a man who builds things that touch the sky. But the words, The words were from the gutter. The entry was dated a week before the collapse, October 12th. The foundation is poured, but the numbers don't add up. Vinny called again. He's not going to wait forever. I'm in too deep. She can never know. I read it once, twice, a third time. The words scrambled and reformed in my brain. Vinny. Numbers don't add up. Too deep. This wasn't the diary of a saint. It was the confession of a sinner. And I was holding it in my hands. The discovery of the journal didn't feel like a victory. It felt like being handed a live grenade. For 2 days, I said nothing. I just watched Clara, this beautiful, sad woman I loved, as she moved through our apartment, trailing the ghost of a man who might have been a complete fraud. Every sigh, every distant look she gave me was now filtered through the lens of that single journal entry. She can never know. My first impulse was to protect her. The lie was her shield, and who was I to take it away? But a second, more insidious thought began to sprout in the dark corners of my mind. This journal wasn't a weapon to destroy Julian's memory. It was a blueprint. To truly understand her grief, to finally get close to her, maybe I didn't need to be better than Julian. Maybe I just needed to understand him. And to understand him, I had to walk in his shoes. So began my secret, morbid project. I, Leo, the perpetually ironic graphic designer, was going to become a method actor. My role? The ghost of perfect boyfriend past. I started reading the journal every night, a page at a time, a meticulous deconstruction of a dead man's soul. I learned that Julian loved Bach's cello suites, believing they were the architecture of emotion. The next evening, I swapped my usual noisy indie rock for the soaring, melancholic notes of a cello. Clara walked into the living room, pausing mid-step. "Bach?" she asked, her head tilted. "Since when do you listen to Bach?" "I'm expanding my horizons," I said, trying to sound casual, like a man who naturally evolves. "It's complex." She didn't smile, not exactly, but the tension in her shoulders eased. "Julian loved this one, suite number 1. "I know," I said, a little too quickly. I corrected myself. I mean, it's a classic, right? Stands to reason. She drifted over to the sofa and sat, not close, but not as far away as usual. She closed her eyes. It was the first time in a week we had shared a room without it feeling like a wake. A hit. The drug of her approval went straight to my head. The project escalated. Julian wore a specific brand of expensive leather boots. I found a pair online, vintage. It cost me half a month's freelance pay. The first time I wore them, Clara's eyes flickered down to my feet. A small, almost imperceptible nod. Another hit. "New boots?" "Yeah," I grunted, trying to channel what I imagined was Julian's effortless masculinity. Needed something a little more solid. "They're nice," she said softly. "They'll last forever." Unlike their original owner, I thought, a snarky aside from the old Leo that was quickly being silenced by the new one. The biggest leap was the architecture. Julian's journal was filled with sketches, with notes on form and function, on the interplay of light and space. To me, a building was a thing you went inside to get out of the rain. To him, it was poetry. I, Leo, a man whose entire career was based on 2D images and vibrant, chaotic color, enrolled in an Architecture 101 course online. I'd stay up late, after Clara was asleep, staring at lectures about Doric columns and structural integrity. My brain felt like it was being rewired. My own work began to suffer. My designs felt flat, my passion for them waning. I was pouring all my creative energy into this bizarre resurrection. One night, she woke up to get a glass of water and found me at the kitchen table, surrounded by printouts of Roman aqueducts. "Leo, what are you doing? It's 3 in the morning." I scrambled to sound alert. "Oh, hey, just reading, history." She came closer, her eyes scanning the papers. "This is architecture." "Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. The way these things were built, the permanence of it all." I was spouting crap, paraphrasing a line from Julian's journal. She looked at me, really looked at me, with an expression I couldn't decipher. It wasn't happiness. It was something more complex. Awe, maybe, or confusion. "You've been different lately," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Different good?" I asked, my heart thumping. She didn't answer right away. She just reached out and brushed a stray piece of hair from my forehead, her touch feather light. "Just different," she repeated, and went back to bed. I sat there in the silence of the kitchen, the ghostly image of an aqueduct glowing on my laptop screen. The nightly comparisons had all but stopped. My project was working. I was building a bridge to her, one piece of Julian at a time. I was becoming the man she wanted. And the man I used to be, the snarky, insecure guy who loved punk rock and vibrant colors, was fading. I was winning. I just wasn't sure what the prize was anymore. The problem with method acting is that eventually you have to go off script. Julian's journal was my guide, but it had holes. The biggest one was a name, Vinny. Vinny called again. He's not going to wait forever. Who the hell was Vinny? A little creative Googling, cross-referencing old news articles about the building collapse with public records, gave me a last name. Vincent Vinny Gallo. A man with a rap sheet as long as my arm for assault and loan sharking. A man who, according to a buried news brief, had been questioned and released due to lack of evidence in the aftermath of the collapse. The old Leo, the one who minded his own business, would have stopped there. The new Leo, the one on a mission, found a name associated with Vinny's known associates, Marcus Thorne, a structural engineer. And Marcus Thorne, according to LinkedIn, had been a junior engineer at Julian Croft's prestigious firm until he was fired for performance issues 2 months after Julian's death. It took 3 phone calls and the promise of buying him an expensive bottle of scotch, but Marcus agreed to meet me. We met at a dive bar that smelled of stale beer and desperation. He was a jittery, bitter man with deep lines of resentment carved around his eyes. "So, you're the new guy," Marcus said after his 3rd drink, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Living in the shadow of the great man? How's that working out for you?" "It has its moments," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "I'm just trying to understand what happened, for Clara's sake." He let out a short, barking laugh. "For Clara's sake? Right. You want to understand what happened? Fine. Your boy Julian wasn't a hero. He was a gambler with champagne taste and a beer budget." The directness of it hit me like a physical blow. "He owed money," Marcus continued, his voice low and conspiratorial. "A lot of it. To guys you don't want to owe money to, guys like Vinny Gallo." "The building," I whispered. "The building was his piggy bank," Marcus sneered. "He was signing off on cheap materials, cutting corners everywhere, and pocketing the difference. I saw the reports. I told him, I said, Julian, this rebar is shit. The concrete mix is weak. This thing isn't safe. You know what he did?" I shook my head, my throat suddenly dry. "He fired me. Said I had a negative attitude and wasn't a team player. 2 months later, the whole damn thing pancaked, and his rich family, with the help of the firm's army of lawyers, turned him into a goddamn martyr. The hero who died saving a child. What a load of crap. He wasn't saving a child. He was probably meeting Vinny's guy in the basement to hand over a bag of cash when his own shoddy math caught up with him. The air left my lungs. The entire foundation of my project, the very man I was painstakingly resurrecting, was not just flawed. He was a monster, a criminal whose greed got people killed. I stumbled home in a daze. The apartment, once a shrine to a saint, now felt like a crime scene. I looked at the Bach records, the expensive boots by the door, the architecture books on the coffee table. They were props in a grotesque play. That night things came to a head. I was staring at my laptop, at a complex diagram of a cantilever bridge, but my mind was a vortex of rebar and loan sharks. Clara came and stood behind me. "Still at it?" she asked. Her voice lacked its recent softness. It was tight, brittle. "Just finishing up," I mumbled. "I went to that little Italian place you love tonight," she said, "to pick up dinner. The owner, Tony, asked where you've been. He said you haven't been in for weeks." I loved that place. They knew my order by heart. I hadn't even noticed I'd stopped going. We'd been eating Julian's favorite foods instead. Risotto, steak au poivre. Things that felt alien on my tongue. "I've been busy," I said, a weak defense. "You're always busy," she snapped, her voice rising. "You're busy listening to his music. You're busy reading his books. Last week I saw you practicing his signature in a notebook. His signature, Leo. What is wrong with you?" I spun around in my chair. "I'm trying, Clara. I'm trying to be the person you want." Her face crumpled, a mixture of anger and a pain so deep it scared me. "I never asked for this. I never asked for you to become a cheap copy of a dead man. It's creepy. It's not you. I look at you and I don't even know who you are anymore." She gestured around the room, at all the little changes I'd made, all the pieces of Julian I'd carefully installed. "I don't want this." Her words hit me harder than Marcus's truth bomb. The one thing I thought was working, the one thing I sacrificed myself for, was the very thing pushing her away. My project hadn't built a bridge. It had dug a grave, and I was burying both of us in it. "I don't want you to be him," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I just want you to be Leo." The problem was, after months of playing this part, I wasn't sure who that was anymore. The breaking point arrived in a cream-colored linen-embossed envelope. It was thick, offensively elegant, and addressed to Miss Clara Vance and guest. The cursive script felt like a mockery. Inside, the invitation confirmed my worst fears. Julian's family, the architects of the Grand Lie, were hosting the inaugural Julian Croft Hero Foundation Gala. And Clara, the grieving fiancée, was the guest of honor. She was expected to give a speech. They weren't just polishing the pedestal, they were plating it in gold. They were going to make Clara the high priestess of their fraudulent cult, and I was supposed to stand beside her in a rented tuxedo and applaud. The thought of it, the clinking champagne glasses, the crocodile tears of his family, the soulless speeches celebrating a man who was a gambling, corner-cutting fraud, made me physically ill. I couldn't let her do it. I couldn't let her be their puppet. Marcus's words, Julian's journal, Vinnie Gallo, it was all a toxic sludge in my brain. She deserved the truth, even if it shattered her. I decided to tell her that night. I rehearsed it in my head 100 times, planning my words with the precision of an architect. I'd be gentle but firm. I'd lay out the evidence logically. I made copies of the damning journal pages and my notes from the conversation with Marcus and put them in a neat manila folder. The folder felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She came home late from work, looking exhausted. The invitation was on the kitchen counter where I'd left it. She glanced at it, her face unreadable. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I know," she replied, not looking at me. She sank onto a kitchen stool, her shoulders slumped. "About the gala." This was it. I took a deep breath. "Clara, there's something you need to know about Julian. About the collapse." I slid the manila folder across the counter. "It wasn't what you think." She didn't look at the folder. She just stared at the granite countertop as if it held the secrets of the universe. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, then another. "He was gambling," she whispered. I froze. My entire speech, my carefully prepared evidence, evaporated. "What?" She finally looked up at me, her eyes a storm of emotions I couldn't even begin to name. "I found the statements, a month before it happened, hidden in his office. Thousands of dollars to online betting sites, money we were supposed to be saving for the wedding." The air was sucked out of the room. This wasn't in the script. "We fought," she continued, her voice a raw, broken thing. "The morning of the collapse. It was the worst fight we ever had. I called him a liar. A disappointment." Her body began to tremble, a violent, full-body tremor. He left, and I was so angry, Leo. The last thing I ever said to him, I screamed it at him as he walked out the door. She choked on a sob, wrapping her arms around herself. "I told him I wish I'd never met you." The confession hung in the air between us, heavy and radioactive. The folder on the counter seemed pathetic, irrelevant. My grand revelation was a footnote to her private, 2-year-long nightmare. And in that moment, everything clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The nightly comparisons, the sandalwood candles, the pedestal. It was never about me being inadequate. It was never about him being perfect. It was a prison she had built for herself, brick by brick, every single day. She wasn't holding him up. She was holding herself down by keeping him sainted. She kept her own guilt alive and festering. If she let herself be truly happy, if she moved on with me, it would be a betrayal. Not of him, but of her final hateful words. She was comparing me to a ghost, not to hurt me, but to keep herself chained to her own personal hell. "Clara," I said, my own voice rough with emotion. I walked around the counter and knelt in front of her. The snarky, cynical Leo was gone. All that was left was a man looking at the woman he loved, who was in more pain than he could ever have imagined. "You didn't know," I said softly. "It doesn't matter," she wept, burying her face in her hands. "It doesn't matter." But it did. It mattered more than anything. My whole project had been based on a false premise. I was trying to solve the wrong problem. The ghost wasn't the enemy. It was the guilt. And I had no idea how to fight that. Walking into the gala felt like entering a different dimension, one constructed entirely of money and lies. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling like frozen tears. Waiters in starched white jackets weaved through a sea of black ties and silk dresses, balancing trays of champagne. The air was thick with expensive perfume, and the low hum of self-congratulatory chatter. It was the most beautiful, ugliest room I'd ever been in. Clara was next to me, a ghost in a gorgeous black dress. She was pale and silent, holding my arm with a grip so tight I could feel the tremble in her fingers. We were a united front, but I wasn't sure what we were fighting anymore. My manila folder, fat with its ugly truths, was in the inner pocket of my rented tuxedo jacket. It felt less like a weapon now, and more like a dead weight. We were greeted by Julian's parents. His father, a man with a politician's handshake and predatory smile, clapped me on the shoulder. "Leo, good to see you. A pillar of support for our Clara, I hear." He said it like I was a piece of necessary but uninteresting furniture. His mother, draped in diamonds that could probably end world hunger, gave Clara an air kiss that didn't touch her skin. "You look beautiful, darling. Julian would be so proud." Clara flinched. I felt it, a tiny, violent tremor that shot up her arm and into my chest. We found our assigned table, front and center, a death row seat with a view of the gallows. We sat in silence, pushing bits of salmon around our plates as a string quartet sawed away at some vaguely mournful tune. I watched the room, the smiling faces, the easy laughter. They were celebrating a fiction, a carefully crafted myth, and Clara was the star exhibit. Finally, the lights dimmed. Julian's father walked to the podium, which was flanked by 2 giant, smiling photos of his son. The room fell silent. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice booming with practiced, sonorous grief. "We are here tonight, not to mourn, but to celebrate a life. The life of a son, a friend, a hero." He spoke of Julian's brilliance, his passion, his unflinching integrity. With every lie, I felt the folder in my jacket burn a little hotter. I could do it. I could walk up there, snatch the microphone, and burn their whole fantasy world to the ground. I could tell them about the shoddy rebar, the gambling debts, the loan shark named Vinny. I could expose the whole rotten charade. Vindicator, truth-teller, the man who blew it all up. I glanced at Clara. Her face was a perfect, tragic mask. Her eyes were fixed on the podium, but she wasn't seeing Julian's father. She was seeing a ghost, her ghost. And I realized, in that moment of blinding clarity, that blowing up their lie wouldn't set her free. It would just trap her in a different kind of wreckage, buried under public shame and scandal. She would become the fiancée of a fraud, her grief invalidated, her private penance turned into a public spectacle. This was my choice, not about them, about her. My mission had been to become Julian, to compare myself to him, to match him, to beat him. But that was a fool's errand. The real choice wasn't about him at all. It was about me. Who was I going to be? The man who needed to win, or the man who knew how to rescue someone? Julian's father was reaching his crescendo. And so, in honor of my son, Julian Croft, a man who gave his life so that another might live, I ask you to join me in a moment of silent reflection. The room quieted. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. I didn't reach for the folder. I reached for Clara's hand under the table. Her fingers were ice cold. She flinched. Then her fingers curled around mine. I leaned in close, my lips brushing her ear. "Let's go," I whispered. Her eyes shot open, meeting mine. They were filled with shock, fear, and a tiny, flickering spark of something else. Hope. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. As the room stood in silent, reverent tribute to a lie, I pushed my chair back. It scraped against the polished floor, a sound as loud as a gunshot in the stillness. A few heads turned. I didn't care. I took her hand, pulled her gently to her feet, and led her away from the table. We walked past the smiling photos, past the podium, past the sea of oblivious faces. We walked out of the opulent ballroom, out of the spotlight, and into the cool, clean night air. I didn't expose the secret to the world. I chose to save the only person in that room who mattered. I didn't become Julian. I didn't become a vindicator. I just became the guy who opened the door. The valet brought the car around, his expression carefully blank, as he took in Clara's tear-streaked face and our abrupt departure. The drive home was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than the one we'd been living in for months. The old silence was a thick, suffocating blanket of unspoken things. This was a clean slate, a quiet emptiness waiting to be filled. I parked the car in our spot, but neither of us moved to get out. The engine ticked as it cooled. "You had the folder," she said, her voice small. "The one from the counter. It was in your jacket. You were going to tell them." "Yeah," I admitted. Why didn't you? I turned to look at her in the dim light of the parking garage. Because their lie doesn't matter, Clara. Your pain does. Blowing up their world wouldn't have fixed yours. It would have just made you collateral damage. This was it. The conversation Julian could never have had. The one I was never able to have while I was trying to be him. "I'm so sorry, Leo," she whispered, a fresh wave of tears spilling over. "For all of it. For comparing you. For making you live in his shadow." "Hey," I said softly, reaching across the console to take her hand. "Look at me." She did. "Your sentence is over. You've served enough time. You're allowed to be happy. You're allowed to move on. You don't owe him anything. You don't owe his memory anything. You just owe it to yourself to live." We finally went upstairs. That night, for the first time, we talked, really talked. She told me about the pressure of dating the perfect man, about the secret relief she'd felt when she discovered his flaws because it made him human, and the crushing guilt when those flaws were erased by his public martyrdom. I told her about my insecurity, about the stupid, desperate project to become him, about how I'd lost myself in the process. There were no more ghosts in the room, just two flawed, tired people telling the truth. The next morning, things began to change. While I made coffee, Clara quietly walked into the bedroom. She came back out dragging the cedar chest. Together, without a word, we carried it down to the building's storage locker. We didn't throw it out. It was still a part of her story. But we put it in its proper place. The past. The weeks that followed were a reconstruction. Becoming better was no longer a twisted project to emulate someone else. It was a conscious effort to rebuild myself. I canceled my subscription to Architecture 101. I went to Tony's Italian place and had my favorite pasta. I blasted my old punk rock records until the windows rattled, and I started to draw again. I poured all of it, the anger, the jealousy, the empathy, the eventual peace, into my work. My designs became bolder, more honest, more emotional. They were more me than anything I had ever created. Clara started therapy. It was hard. Some days she was quiet and distant, wrestling with demons I couldn't see. But she was wrestling. She wasn't surrendering anymore. She stopped lighting the sandalwood candles. One afternoon I came home to find she'd bought a new one. It smelled like lemons and basil. It smelled like a new beginning. 6 months later, our apartment was unrecognizable. My vibrant, chaotic art hung on the walls where somber, minimalist prints used to be. The air smelled like coffee and lemon, not sandalwood and grief. It was our home, finally. Its blueprint was drawn from our own specifications. I was in my home office, a corner of the living room I had reclaimed, putting the finishing touches on a massive branding project for a new music festival. It was the biggest contract of my career, one with the portfolio I'd built from the ashes of my Julian phase. It was work that was unapologetically mine. Clara came in, holding 2 mugs of coffee. She set one down on my desk, her hip resting against the edge as she looked at the design on my screen. It was a riot of color and energy, centered around a stylized phoenix. A little on the nose, maybe, but it felt right. There were no ghosts in her eyes. The haunted, distant look was gone, replaced by a clear, calm warmth that still made my heart skip a beat. "It's brilliant, Leo," she said, her voice easy and light. She wasn't just being supportive. She saw the work, the skill, the soul in it. "I'm so incredibly proud of you." I looked from the screen to her face, to the genuine smile that reached her eyes. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that she wasn't comparing me to anyone. Not to Julian, not to an idea, not to a ghost. I wasn't the better man. He wasn't the lesser. We were just men who had walked different paths, but I was the one who was here, the one who was real. I had stopped comparing and started becoming someone better. I had to become better for myself first, and in doing so, I'd finally built something real, something with a solid foundation, right here with her. I smiled back, a real smile, with no shadows behind it. "Thanks," I said. "I'm pretty proud of us."